Thank you all for joining us today on this last day of the Middle East Institute's Climate Week, highlighting the impact that climate change is having on the Middle East. I'm Deborah Lair, Executive Director of the Paulson Institute and an MEI board member. We're so pleased to be joining with MEI and hosting the discussion today, given the importance of the sustainability issues in the Middle East region and globally. I'll be moderating today's panel, the last in the week of trends in green finance on the Middle East and lessons to be learned from China. But before we get started, just a quick reminder, we'll do a Q&A session in the latter half of the hour. Please take the opportunity to submit your questions and we'll make every attempt to answer them. We're very fortunate to have a really excellent group of speakers today. We have Ambassador Yasser El-Nagar. He is the CEO of EN Investment and a career diplomat, having previously served as the Deputy Minister of Investment and the Deputy Minister of Planning for Egypt, as well as the Deputy Chief of Mission here in Washington, D.C. at the Embassy. David Sandalow. David is the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University and previously served in many senior positions in the U.S. government at the White House, State Department, and was the Undersecretary of Energy. Damien Ma. Damien is the Executive Director of Macro Polo, the think tank of the Paulson Institute. He's currently also an adjunct fellow at Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. A warm welcome to all of our panelists. We're going to kick off our session today with a quick poll of the audience to set the stage, and then we'll have another one towards the end. Please. Okay. All right, so we have a tie, 38%, 38% between successful and fairly unsuccessful. Well, let's see, based on our discussion today, if any of those results change. The last 2 weeks have been very busy when it comes to climate, beginning with Secretary Kerry's visit to the UAE, noted before he went to China, and then flying on to China, resulting in a joint statement about potential cooperation on climate with the United States. And then President Biden hosting the Climate Leaders Summit that ends today. As we enter into the post-COVID recovery period, we hope a green recovery is a priority for many countries around the world. There's definite momentum. Major banks such as JP Morgan, Citigroup, and Bank of America are each pledging over $1 trillion to transition to zero carbon. The European Union is the first to pass a green recovery plan. And China has committed to carbon neutrality by 2060 and is about to launch the largest carbon trading exchange in the world, which when launched will cover 14% of global emissions. This positive momentum for climate is indeed encouraging, and in the Middle East, addressing the climate challenge is even more crucial. With a regional economy that's highly tied to the fortunes of traditional oil and gas energy, the green and sustainable transition will not be an easy task by any means, and it will require a vast amount of capital. The amount of finance needed to facilitate the transition globally to an environmental sustainable economy is estimated to be between 2.5 trillion to 4 trillion over the next 3 decades. and governments can only provide about 10 to 15% of those funds. That's not lost on many of the stakeholders in the Middle East region, which are already starting to take action. Egypt has issued green sovereign bonds. The UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have incorporated sustainability into their economic development plans, and companies in the region have already started to issue green sukuks. As you've been hearing in the discussions this week as part of MEI's Climate Week, there's much that the region needs to do if it wants to curb the climate impact, and it needs to move quickly. This is not just about the social and environmental imperative, but it's an economic one as well. Climate change can be a driver of economic growth and job creation. Many experts believe that we're on the verge of a climate boom, similar to the tech boom of the late 1990s, as governments, corporations, and institutions seek to change policy, create incentives, and promote innovation around climate change. One study just focused on China estimated that the market for environmental goods and services could be a $16 trillion opportunity with the creation of 40 million jobs by 2060. As we look around the world, we see plenty of opportunity. China's been a leader in promoting green finance as a tool to address climate and to develop new technologies, as well as part of its overall global diplomacy. Today, we'll explore China's path and how some of these experiences might be relevant for the Middle East. So David, let me start with you. Could you help set the stage for us? We have climate as a priority in China, in the US, the EU, and now the Middle East. Why has it recently become such a major focus for economic institutions like the G20 and G7? How did we get here, and what are the major focus areas?
Well, first, Deborah, thanks to you and congratulations to MEI on this great program and the focus on climate change this week. I think two trends have driven the focus on climate change. First are just the extraordinary impacts we're seeing from climate change around the world. For those who don't follow this closely, we're at an extraordinary point right now with respect to the buildup of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. The concentrations of those gases are now at a higher level than they have ever been in the history of the human race. It's a pretty dramatic statement, but it's true. They're higher than they've been since human beings first started walking this planet, and they're continuing to grow. And the impacts of that are everywhere. I mean, just the data is striking that the 7 warmest years ever recorded have been the last 7 years. And we're seeing record-breaking heat in cities and all around the world. We had last year about 5 times more heat records than cold records around the world. And I know in my country, in the United States, we've seen unbelievable forest fires in our West precipitated by climate change. We've seen dramatic flooding events and rain events. One of the maybe ironic implications of the buildup of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere is you have more droughts and more floods. The hydrologic cycle intensifies. And then in the Middle East, we've seen temperatures reach levels where human beings can barely live. And if this trend continues in the decades ahead, we're going to have literally uninhabitable places as a result of heat in some parts of the region. So that's one trend. The climate change problem is getting worse, and that's focusing attention on. The second trend is solutions are becoming more clear. And in the past decade, we have seen extraordinary drops in the cost of clean energy technology. Solar panels in particular have come down by about 90% in cost in the past decade. Wind power costs have come down dramatically. Energy storage costs have come down dramatically. So at the same time that the problem is becoming so vivid, the solutions are also becoming more clear. Now, make no mistake, we've got a lot to do in order to develop solutions kind of every sector of the economy. But there's a lot of basis for optimism that we can solve the problem and that we can create lots of jobs and economic growth in the process. And then final comment, I think these two trends converged in a really extraordinary event yesterday, which is continuing today, which is the US president hosting this climate change summit. And I've worked in foreign policy for much of my long career. It's really striking for me to see climate change now be a core foreign policy issue. When I first started my career, that was not the case. But now we have a US president come into office, and within 100 days, he's holding a meeting of world leaders on this topic. In fact, I'd say literally no issue has gotten more highly visible public attention from the US president than climate change, since he came into office. And that's true in governments all over the world. So I think this is now at the center of the radar screen globally in terms of issues we need to address because of these two factors, both the the problem that is so vivid and the solutions that are becoming increasingly clear.
David, that's great to set the stage for us. We really appreciate that. So let's turn to the region, Ambassador El-Nagar, and our poll and our audience here are not very optimistic about how the Middle East is going to do in the transition to climate change. Do you think that there is a chance for a green recovery in the Middle East? And what would you say are whether some of the obstacles or some of the opportunities for this?
Okay, I lost you, but you're asking about the obstacles, I guess. Is that right?
Yes, that our
Hello?
audience was not necessarily optimistic about the Middle East transition, and you think that
rightly so. I mean, I share this. I share this lack of optimism. Actually, I guess I mean, again, if I take what David was talking about at this point, and when you look back over the last year and you see the changes in climate, the degrees of heat, the degrees of cold, weather, it was not long ago when everybody was laughing about the camels having the snow on them in Saudi Arabia. Having said all of this, I think there are two types of economies in the MENA regions. There are economies that are really dependent on informal sectors. And these economies, climate change is not a priority in them. It's not a priority neither as an issue per se, nor as an economic opportunity. Okay, the investors are not. They don't have the capacity to actually invest, okay, in developing their economies. Others are a bit richer, and they look at it as a sort of, an attractive issue now, especially when you have the new administration come and takes a strong lead in this issue, having appointed Secretary Kerry as the special envoy, and having the president hosting this summit that we're witnessing over the last 2 days. Now, what does that entail in a country like Egypt, for example, where renewable energy has become cheaper, as was said right now? Still, Egypt has, a good mix, but that mix is also dependent mostly on conventional types of energy production. In the Gulf countries, while there are initiatives like in UAE and some in Saudi Arabia and so on, it has not taken, did not take off to become like a major source of producing energy there. Now, in all these issues, I think we as a region do not view this as a priority at this point in time. We also do not see it as an economic opportunity at this point in time. So apart from bits and pieces of minimal initiatives about new energy vehicles, about solar plant here or a windmill there, there's not a sort of a cohesive approach to new energy and to renewable and to climate change, combating climate change in the region.
Great. Thanks, Yasser. And you mentioned some of the technologies, and this leads very nicely into a question for Damien. China has been a leader on green finance and has a very ambitious agenda when it comes to climate, clearly on the diplomacy side, but also on technology. Where are some of the areas that they're focusing, and why have they picked some of those sectors, Damien?
Well, thank you, Deborah, and it's great to be with everyone here and such distinguished panelists. I think you said earlier at the outset, Deborah, that there's been a tech boom over the last decade, and that we're entering kind of a climate boom in the next decade. And I think it's important to set the scene at the outset that, you know, the tech boom that we're talking about in the previous decade is a very different kind of technology than what's about to come, or has already emerged, right? If you think about what's dominated our minds and news headlines, it's, you know, acronyms like FANG, right? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix. But what are those companies? They're predominantly internet-based companies, technology. It's all about the internet. But what's going to count a lot more in clean tech is manufacturing, because you're going to have to make tangible products like solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and that actually plays to China's strength because they've spent more than a decade now building up that manufacturing ecosystem. And a lot of that actually surprisingly started after the financial crisis, when the rest of the world was dealing with the financial fallout. China, as you recall, spent about $600 billion in their stimulus. A lot of that did go to waste, but some of that found its way into things like solar and wind. And they had massive policy to support those industries. So China now is one of the leaders when it comes to solar panels. They have about 60 to 65% of global capacity. So they absolutely dominate, and the quality is there. David mentioned, that the price has come down on solar. Well, a lot of that is because of China. So just as the China price used to be applied to shoes and socks, the China price can also appropriately be applied to new clean technology. And so I think, in terms of the specific categories, I would say, solar, wind, I already talked about, but I would say an important thing is this foundational input, which is the battery. Right now it's the lithium ion battery, but there will be advances there. It's not just about EVs, it's not just about cars, it's also about storage. For solar to really truly reach its potential, you need a lot of storage, and battery is a great place to store. So that's another place that China's really, I think, really captured a supply chain there. And finally, I would also put nuclear in the equation. I know that elicits certain concerns for a lot of people, but I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in nuclear, particularly even on the fusion side. I have not seen as many fusion startups that I can recall in the last few years. And I think that's a really interesting area to look into. And so China is obviously trying to also establish some leadership there. So you got all these categories that is, it's less about digging stuff up from the ground. That's what natural resources used to be, but it's really about making the things to harness the sun and the wind. And China right now has some advantages there in terms of their manufacturing.
Great. And I think also you've picked technologies where China really has been able to leapfrog built infrastructure and be competitive, so that they're not picking necessarily, right, they're going to compete in today's automobile, but they're developing the automobile of the future to be competitive, and the same with energy.
Absolutely. And China has always had, resource scarcity other than coal. It didn't have a lot of oil. It didn't have a lot of natural gas. So it made sense for them to get into these clean tech where they don't have to rely as much on oil and gas.
Mm-hmm. Well, great. Well, very insightful. And David, let me turn back to you, because you follow these issues globally, and you, I know, pay particular attention to what's been happening in China and have advised them even in their very ambitious plans. Talk a little bit about what is happening in China today when it comes to green finance, and what are some lessons that the Middle East could learn from some of the steps that China has been taking?
I'll just pick up from where Damien was talking about, and I guess I'll offer maybe three lessons. The first lesson is think long term, and the Chinese government is just extraordinary in this regard, in my view. China operates with 5-year plans. They're currently in their 14th 5-year plan. Chinese government has what's called their 2 millennial or centennial goals, kind of 100-year goals or long-term goals. There's a current goal to become a prosperous middle-class society by 2049. In the climate change area, President Xi Jinping got a lot of attention in last fall by announcing a goal of carbon neutrality by 2060, a 40-year goal. And that long-term planning, I think, is really important when it comes to the transition towards clean energy. And for the Middle East, what I would particularly recommend is a focus on low carbon fuels and the long-term development of low carbon fuels. You know, a lot of the world, we have trillions of dollars of infrastructure built for liquid fuels, much of which is supplied by the Middle East. Now, current fuels emit carbon dioxide when burned, and that's going to be a problem. That's a problem, and there's a long-term need to phase out those fuels. But there are low carbon fuels that can be made with electrolysis and so-called green ammonia or green hydrogen fuels. And the Middle East can be a place where the world gets those fuels for tremendous profit. I was just in a meeting a couple of days ago where the energy minister of Chile was talking about how his country, because it has one of the sunniest deserts in the world, wants to position itself as a leading export of low carbon fuels. Well, the Middle East has tremendous capability to be in that market as well, but it's going to require long-term planning. And I think the Chinese government, as Damien was saying, is kind of really, and Deborah was saying, both of you, has really been good at getting out ahead on these issues and thinking about the industries of the future. So that's point one. Point two, integrate, another lesson to learn from China is integrate climate change into your financial system. And this goes to the core of the question you were asking, Deborah. The People's Bank of China was the first central bank in the world to have green finance standards. The Chinese government has had very thoughtful policies in this area, building up capacity within the financial system to fund sustainability projects that are sustainable, developing standards in this regard, and that type of green lending, the massive use of green bonds, can make a huge difference, and I think is really central to addressing this issue. And then a third lesson is focusing on resilience and adaptation. And whatever we do, we are going to be experiencing climate change and global warming in the decades ahead. We can prevent the worst impacts from happening, but they're going to be with us. And we need to both do everything we can to reduce emissions, but protect ourselves against the worst impacts of what's going to come. Chinese government has been very thoughtful in a number of ways in this regard with forestation programs in China. And there's measures that could be taken in the Middle East region as well with adaptation to protect against the worst impacts that may lie ahead.
Great. So Yasser, David mentioned earlier the importance of the event that President Biden is hosting, the Climate Summit, from a foreign policy perspective. But China, too, has been looking at climate as a foreign policy issue. It's been using it to build ties with the European Union, certainly with the Middle East, with Latin America. It's using the export of some of the technologies that Damien was mentioning, new energy vehicles, solar panels, its know-how, the opportunity to cooperate, things like the development and sharing its expertise in the creation of carbon exchanges to build ties with countries in the region, and certainly infrastructure, and we hope it'll be clean infrastructure in the Middle East, where it's financing development of whole cities in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia. So as part of its program of exporting these clean technologies, what do you see happening? Is the Middle East really welcoming of Chinese technologies? And as you look to the future, do you see this becoming an issue in its foreign policy between the United States and the Middle East and China and the Middle East? I think the ambassador might be having some technical issues there. Yeah, we'll wait 1 second. Let's see.
think we lost him.
Yes, I think we lost him. So Damien, we'll come back to the ambassador, but as I was saying, technology is really at the core of one of the challenges between the United States and China. A lot of the tension that we have in the bilateral relationship is based around whether it's the development of 5G with Huawei or even now competition with our auto companies. We haven't seen so much of this in clean tech, but how do you look at it in the future? And do you see the same for Yasser, that the MENA region could be caught in the middle of a climate clash between the United States and China?
Well, I think anytime you have these dramatic transformative economic transitions associated with technology, there will absolutely be politics. I think it will be determined the extent to which populist politics in the United States get kind of infects kind of this debate on climate to the extent that we want to everyone wants green collar jobs. It's not just the United States. China wants it too. China has a big coal sector, right? So if they want to transition those people out of it, same with here. So I think it will certainly be politicized to some extent, but I think we have to also be clear that yes, there will be green jobs created, but when it comes to solar, for example, there's actually not that many jobs specifically in the manufacturing itself because it's a commodity product. It's an assembly line. I visited these factories. It's very automated. A lot of jobs will come in the after sales services and installation, putting it on roofs and servicing those things. So we have to be clear about, do we really want to have do we really want to build an integrated supply chain from scratch in this country versus sort of just allowing investment to kind of build up that capacity here? Or, what the Germans did was, Germany basically had decided it was more important for them to have a faster clean tech transition. And they were taking Chinese solar panels. So I think, each country will have to decide on its own sort of what the politics that might be. But I think for the Middle East, I think it would be important to think about, does the Middle East want to establish or become a regional hub of clean tech manufacturing? If China wants to sell, if the US market becomes more closed, then China is going to want to seek new markets. And the best way to get markets is to actually have your supply chain close to where the end market is. So I think there's a big opportunity to not just have East Asia be the clean tech manufacturing hub, but to have it around the world, whether it's Latin America, Middle East, and the Middle East can certainly, I think, shoot for that, to happen, especially if things become more, let's say, testy between the US and China when it comes to clean tech.
Great. And Mr. Ambassador, we had talked about, I'm not sure if you heard the question before, but that David had talked about how the US is now using climate as part of its foreign policy with other countries. And certainly we've seen that as the case with China. And you've also written about the fact that many of the technologies that are being developed in China are much more appropriate to the Middle East markets than necessarily ones coming from the United States. They're geared more towards emerging markets. Do you see China continuing to use this as diplomacy in the Middle East and whether it will be effective or not? And are there any concerns about the Middle East being caught in the middle between the United States and China in some kind of climate clash?
I don't really think that this is sort of a scope of competition between the United States and China, the Middle East. I think what China provides in some instances, the United States cannot provide. I mean, the finance mechanisms, soft loans mechanisms, all these financial tools that are utilized by China are not available to the United States. In terms of technology, I think while the region is more, sort of acquainted with the Western technologies in many spheres, it's now actually opening up quickly to Chinese technology. You see a lot of startups, actually Chinese startups, having offices in the region, whether it is in Egypt or in Dubai. Now it's going to be in Saudi Arabia. So in terms of clash in the climate change sphere, I don't see that. What I see is maybe is maybe China linking their financial tools to green projects, to financing certain projects along the Silk Road Fund, Silk Road Initiative, basically in new technology and so on and so forth. But COVID has slowed down everything. So I think by the fall of this year, when the United States economy is going to open, when the Chinese economy is going to reignite, when the MENA region will also be highly vaccinated, I think we are going to see new trends in the Chinese approach to the region.
Well, thank you. Well, we're going to take a moment to do another poll just to see what our audience reaction is. If you could post that, please. Following on, we're talking about what a potential climate clash might look like. Okay, and for the results, we have 41% saying there's a stalemate and countries form multiple hubs of influence. This is something that Damien and our chairman has talked about, Hank Paulson, in terms of an economic iron curtain. Certainly, we hope that countries are willing to find a framework to avoid that, because we think some competition is good. It's in the best interest of everyone, but it's certainly going to be challenging if it turns into some kind of climate war. We do have a question from the audience, so let me take a moment to read that. It seems no finance ministry from the Middle East is a signatory of the Helsinki Principles. There seems to be little appreciation of the role of domestic public finance, carbon taxes, green expenditures, fiscal incentives, PPPs, so on, in the climate finance agenda, and most of the focus remains on the private and international finance. Any hints on how to break that ice amongst the public finance institutions in the Middle East, a region where long-term strategic thinking will benefit if and when the governments lead the process? So anyone, David, would you like to take a first shot at that?
I would defer to the ambassador, whose expertise is much deeper in the region than mine. But I would say look to public finance institutions, around the world who are really paying close attention to this. I've looked to the World Bank, look to the Asia Development Bank, actually, which is based in Beijing and is really decided not to focus on high carbon infrastructure. It's really a pattern that is strong in development banks around the world and in public finance institutions. I think there's lots of lessons to be learned there.
Ambassador, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I share this view. I mean, you can look at the World Bank, and you can look at the Asia Infrastructure Bank. But again, I think that the two of us are basically going to be not only the international mechanisms, but also the bilateral mechanisms. And this is again where China actually holds an edge with regards to funding mechanisms to the region.
Yeah, exactly.
And thanks to the ambassador. I misspoke, and I meant the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, of course, is based in Beijing, and that's what I was referring to. Although the Asia Development Bank, which is based in Manila, is also really doing some great things in this area as well. So we're seeing this trend in financial institutions around the world.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of innovative thinking coming out of the AIIB too, as it looks to its financing overseas. One of the big issues that they're thinking of taking on, which could be quite relevant in the Middle East, is looking at how to finance nature. Sort of how do you start to look at bats and bees and trees as asset classes? And for the Middle East, certainly looking at cultural tourism or coastal tourism and putting some kind of price on the benefits of that could be very innovative, and testing out how you think and changing the concept around how you look at nature and how you look at climate change. David, the question from the audience raises really the question we were talking about earlier. There are lots of big commitments being made when it comes to climate change and very ambitious goals for the future, but as I mentioned in my opening statement, many times governments can only pay about 10 to 15% of this. And so that really means that the rest of the money needs to come from multilateral financial institutions or really even the private sector. If you were advising MENA governments, what kinds of actions would you be telling them to take around attracting the kind of private sector capital necessary to help them in this transition to a low carbon economy?
I think first I would recommend just clear policy frameworks, and governments around the world are setting a price on carbon. That type of clear policy signal can make a big difference. Of course, there's some countries in the region that don't even charge for electricity or charge very minimal amounts for electricity. I think moving towards market-based pricing for energy within the bounds of what's politically possible, I think is important. But clear policy signals, and then co-financing can make a big difference as well. I mean, I want to go back in particular to emphasize the potential for the region in low carbon fuels or zero carbon fuels. I think this is going to be an enormous industry of the future. These are going to be big capital intensive projects. I think there will be lots of private capital that's interested in investing in this, but particularly at the beginning, as these are being scaled up, there may need to be some public co-financing in order for private sector capital to come in. And I think governments that are prepared to do that, I think will benefit over the long term pretty significantly.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, you work a lot with the private sector across the Middle East there. Do you see that climate is becoming more on their radar screen, and they're starting to see, as we see in the United States and certainly with China, the corporate community is now sort of on the bandwagon, and they are committing, whether it's the financial institutions like the big banks, as I mentioned, committing significant money to invest and change their own investing practices into this transition, to starting to have requirements about the types of places where they'll put their money, or even looking at what their own practices are and how they transition themselves to kind of low carbon, zero carbon. Is this a trend that has caught on in the Middle East yet, or is this something yet to come?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, there are, and you can see it with mainly the foreign investors. They are, due to reasons, to policies at their headquarters, applying more and more climate-friendly policies in their production facilities, and so on and so forth. And this is catching up also to local businesses, and although not as vigorous as in the Western world or in China, but it's catching on. But mainly, if you go to the region, mainly the catalysts for such policies are foreign direct investments.
We have another question actually from the audience. We have quite a few actually. One following up Yasser, on what you were saying, some Middle East economies are rentier and heavily dependent on fossil fuels. What is the impact of green tech financially but socially in these economies? Yasser, do you want to take that one?
Repeat that, please. Sorry.
So it was looking at, because the Middle East economies are so dependent on fossil fuels, what's the impact of green tech socially in the region? I think we're having a problem with the internet there. So Damien, one for you. Do you see Chinese investments in renewable energy with tied financing and concessional terms, Chinese workers and Chinese contractors in the Middle East as a strategy from the Chinese government to increase its influence, including under the BRI, to the detriment of the United States and European Union?
Well, I think influence here is really secondary. I mean, it's, China's big BRI, project or initiative. It's all encompassing, and it's happening in places in Africa and Latin America as well. So I think China really looks at it as its idea of economic globalization and integration going west, because I think it felt that given what's happening with the United States, things were not necessarily looking that great in terms of, on traditional markets. So it's trying to build markets west of China. And so to me, it's much more of an economic rationale. We can debate about whether, the model of sending Chinese workers and laborers there is the right model. And I think that's something China is probably going to have to adjust, because I think those, quickly realize that they're going to encounter a lot of local politics, just like any foreign investor. And I think, China will have to climb that learning curve, but, they're just getting started. So I would say influence or not, that's really a kind of a secondary on, the economic integration, the economic market has to come first. And so that's what they're trying to do. And so I think that model is going to get adjusted over time.
And one of the interesting things that we have seen coming out of China, it hasn't been adopted as policy, but their Ministry of Environment has actually made a recommendation about it, is to develop an environmental ranking system for projects along the Belt and Road. And if they were going to do this and do what they're talking about, kind of a stoplight system where they would rank them as red, yellow, green, and then linking that to any kind of financing coming from Chinese institutions. And that could have a significant impact on countries in the Middle East, because again, as we were saying, Chinese are providing much of the construction and the financing of some of the big infrastructure projects in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, in the UAE. And now if the financing is tied to meeting certain sustainability standards, because on China's side, in the willingness to loan, it could force or be a means of encouraging governments to change their own policies. We've yet to see whether that's going to happen or not. David, a question for you on carbon trading. As I mentioned in the opening, when China launches its national carbon exchange, it's starting with just one industry, which is going to be power, and already it will cover 14% of global emissions. We could see by the time the additional industries are added, 5 to 7 other of China's major polluting industries, it could bring under its own trading scheme 30-40% of global emissions. China's also in active discussions with certain governments in the Middle East of starting their own carbon exchanges. How do you see this sort of working? And are you concerned about China's dominance, essentially, of the carbon trading market? Is this a good thing, a bad thing? And how can the Middle East be a part of that?
I think it's a good thing. I think China's building, as you said, the kind of largest carbon market in the world, that's putting a price on carbon emissions in a way that is very important and powerful policy tool to help control climate change. It's very much a work in progress, and it's been pretty slow, the development of the Chinese emissions trading program. But it is being launched in the power sector, as you said. There are plans to expand it. There's plans to eventually bring on a hard cap on emissions, which I think is going to be really important in terms of addressing the climate change problem. And it's bringing market-based principles into the solution to the problem here. And Middle East countries can absolutely participate by developing their own programs, and then over time integrating, actually not just into the Chinese system and into the European system, which is much longer standing. And even in California, where the state of California, the United States, has a very well-developed system. So I think this is part of the global toolkit for solving the global warming problem. But also just comment on the really important points you were making about the Belt and Road Initiative and stoplights in terms of kind of green impacts of those projects. I think for several years, the Chinese government has had a guidance for promoting Green Belt and Road, which was developed by a number of influential ministries, which has extremely strong green goals incorporated into that guidance. The first time I read it, I thought it looked like it was kind of written by Greenpeace or another environmental organization. It was so strong. This guidance is so strong. There have not yet been implementation tools to actually make sure those principles are applied in practice. And I think we're starting to see signs that there might be implementation tools like the type you were describing, Deborah, that would make a big difference. And I think the Middle East region can really it's worth paying attention to those because I think those may be coming, and I think there's actually big opportunities for the region as those get developed.
Yeah, I agree. Damien, do you have any additional thoughts on the Belt and Road and these green principles?
I will just add one quick point. I think having these sorts of systems or stoplights or standards is extremely important because we are, I think, as we've talked about, a lot of this is going to be infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And these are 20, 30 years. Anytime we put something down, it's 20, 30 years. So we need to think about in advance or before we put this down, what kind of standards we should have so that this carbon stuff and the efficiency is kind of priced, baked in for 20, 30 years. So it's really important that we're thinking about a way ahead of, going forward, just moving and putting in highways or whatever, wind turbines. It's a long-term asset. And so it needs some thinking in terms of, how we deal with the next 20, 30 years.
Right. And it's really essential because to get this right up front, because the infrastructure build that is going on now, if it's not done in a sustainable manner, could actually be equivalent to the size of China's carbon emissions today. And so as we look at all that new building that's going on, particularly across the Middle East, it's really important that these kinds of issues be taken into account. Otherwise, we're going to find as China's addressing and reducing its carbon emissions, the Middle East regions are going up. And then they're going to be facing some of the similar pressures from the global community that China's facing today. But without maybe the upside, David, that you were talking about in terms of the economic opportunity, because the economic opportunity is now as this new field develops. Mr. Ambassador, if we have you with us, do you have any additional thoughts to add? I know you followed the Belt and Road issues and you see it firsthand in terms of the relationships in Egypt.
Yes, I think it's important for us all to, in terms of the relationship between the MENA region and both the United States and China in the area of climate change and the area of green finance, is to wait until the end of the year when COVID, the impact of COVID is subsided, and both countries would see how they would prioritize this in their foreign policy and how they will prioritize this in their sort of aid and financial support. So just not to be, sort of optimistic or less optimistic. I think it's just to be realistic. I think it's important to wait and see. China has an edge, but we have a new American administration who has put climate change as a top priority. So we have to see how all of this will be linked in foreign policy, and I don't see that happening except maybe in September with the general debate of the United Nations. That season, when it starts, we will see. We'll have more clarity about this.
Great. Well, I think that is a nice place to end. I'm sorry, we have other questions that we don't really have time for, but I want to thank our panelists. I think we've covered a lot of issues. I think, David, you kicked us off with the problems being more urgent than ever, as we've seen reflected in the temperature, and the solutions more clear. And you and the ambassador have talked about this being a foreign policy issue now that's being incorporated at the highest of levels into discussions, whether it's through this summit, which is the first major event that the president has brought foreign leaders together for, and through the G7 and the G20, which are meeting this year, and certainly the COP happening in the UK. Technology is going to be a driver of this, and its potential could be or couldn't be a potential clash between the United States and China that could play out in the MENA area. But the good news is there's lots of opportunity. A lot of the corporations and financial institutions are looking at how they can put money behind this and look at innovative financing and help countries, particularly emerging markets where so much of the problem is occurring, in finding ways to implement their commitments, and particularly their commitments around Paris. So many thanks, David, Damien, and Yasser, for the discussion today. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate our audience listening, and we hope you have a rest of a good day there.